Welcome to Our Work with Pavan Sidhu, the podcast where we delve deep into the minds of leaders who are rewriting the rules and driving positive change, bringing you open conversations that offer wisdom and insights on the power of authenticity. Now here's your host, a seasoned executive on her own journey, Pavan.
Okay, so today's podcast is going to be a little bit different in the sense that it is not a conversation between me and one guest. It is more of a panel style conversation, if you want to call it that. I have two guests today. The first, Leena Thomas, who is a mechanical engineer and a senior project manager at Hatch, and she also holds a master's in women's and gender studies. Welcome, Leena. And Leslie Doka, who is the director of construction at Wright Construction. And the thing, in addition to working in traditionally male-dominated or male-led spaces, we are also all three mothers and partners. And as Leslie pointed out, successful career-focused individuals, and we're proudly experienced at navigating all three roles in our life. So the objective today of our podcast or our conversation is to talk a little bit about a tougher topic. So talking specifically around gender equity and careers. This has been a fairly central theme in my life, I would say. I think for a lot of feedback I've had over the last, now that the first 5 or 6 podcasts are out, a lot of feedback I've had is like, the reason this topic is really important to me is because I've worked in this construction space. And actually, that's not true. This topic was important to me well before I ever started working. And it goes back, so I'm first generation Canadian. I was born here in BC, but my mom and my grandma. So I just going back 2 generations on my side. So my maternal side, my grandma was born in a small province in northwest India called Punjab, and she was born in the mid-30s. My grandma was married at the age of 10. She had her first of 6 children at the age of 16. Oh. And my mom, she had an opportunity at having a bit of a childhood. She didn't get married until her early 20s, but gender and traditional roles, maybe, although she had the opportunity to have a childhood, there was other parts of her life that she didn't have as much choice over, right? So I really, going back 2 generations for sure, I'm really the first generation of women in my family that has had choice, right? Choice, first of all, the ability to have a childhood, which really shouldn't be a choice at all, but I had the ability to have a childhood. I had the ability to choose who I married. If I got married, I had the ability to choose when and how many children I wanted to have. I had the ability to think about what I wanted to spend my life doing from a career perspective, right? So that's why this topic is really, really important to me. So got a little heavy there, but I thought it was really important just to frame why I want to have this conversation and why I will always be doing work in this space, right? So the target audience for today's episode is twofold. So first, it is young men and women, or really men and women at any stage of their career. If you're making decisions or figuring out how to navigate career and or family life, if you're figuring out how to be a partner to a woman who is trying to navigate that world, if you're a young woman trying to decide, hey, what are the values I'm going to choose from a personal life perspective? Do I want to have partnership? Do I want to have children? If you're in that stage of life, I think this is information that's important for everybody to hear. So in addition to men and women navigating this dichotomy, the other side of this is we want to talk to organizations. So in my work that I've done in the inclusivity space over the last few years, I've spoken to a lot of organizations that want to attract and retain female talent or women talent and really just don't know where to start. And they typically don't know where to start because they don't have any women at their leadership table, right? So they know that they want to figure this out and they know they're maybe not the most inclusive employer or company or organization, but they just really don't have the perspective when they're making decisions to figure out how to start. So we're hoping that this conversation, you've got 3 accomplished women who have navigated the space, who are obviously interested in the topic, that can at least give you some perspective to figure out how to start. So those are the 2 different topics or 2 different audiences and kind of what we're talking about today. Is that fair so far?
Sounds good.
Agreed.
Sounds good. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say. So originally, Leena, Leslie, and I have actually been kind of conversing for several months here, trying to figure out really how to tackle and how to start talking about this topic. It is so broad. It has so many different nuances that the starting point was really challenging for us to kind of pinpoint until we heard Harrison Butker, who is a kicker for, I think, the Kansas City Chiefs, an NFL team in the States. He made some remarks at a commencement ceremony for a Catholic university in the southern US in Kansas City, I think it was. He made some remarks back in May, and when we all heard that, we were like, much of the world had a bit of a reaction and thought, okay, at the very least, this is a good starting point for our discussion. So again, a lot of our discussion is going to be more so not really addressing him necessarily, but addressing what we wish would have been told to those young people at that ceremony that day. So everybody has heard these, but I'm going to just quickly reiterate. He said, I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now about to cross the stage and are thinking about all of the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are the most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into the world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother. I'm on the stage today and able to be the man I am because I have a wife who leans into her vocation. Right. So what did you guys think when you first heard that? What was your thought or your reaction?
My reaction was, like, it's just like, really?
Yeah.
Are we back in the 1800s or further? What is this?
Yeah.
That was my first reaction. Very strange commencement speech to give to a group of people who have just worked really, really hard to do this major accomplishment in their life, and they've been told that you've been lied to, it's worthless, your true potential is in your ability to have children and be a partner to, let's say, a man, because that's probably his perspective. Outrageous. Like, what's going on here?
I think my initial reaction when it surfaced in the media was I kind of ignored it, to be honest. It wasn't something that really flagged for me at the start. And as it gained momentum in the media, and there was lots of, everything from support to a lot of criticism, to a lot of jokes made on behalf of surrounding this content and the speech. But I think that, there's even duality within the speech. You didn't quote the part in the speech where he talks about the importance of him being a father. So he can be a father and a kicker. He can do both. But, his wife is called to this singular action and calling. So I think it also is part of my regard at the time was due to, I think, the religious component. I think there is,
Right.
A very Catholic, strong, traditional Catholic view held at that college. So, unfortunately, that is matching. Those views are matching with that traditional Catholic view. Not all Catholic views, but I think they very much focus on that traditionalism of family structure. So, I guess it makes sense in a way. I'm not agreeable to it at all. But unfortunately, I think there's, quite strong views that would agree with that within that group of people.
Yeah.
I find it strange that, most likely that university vetted that speech and allowed it to be given to this graduating class. So what views do they actually hold? Are they just in the business of taking these women's money giving them degrees, but saying we don't actually think that you should be doing this.
It is an interesting point because, a good percentage of the college graduates are female. And what is the intention behind their education for that vocation? I think we see it as an education for a career focus. That is a really good point.
I did a little bit of reading, and the school never actually came and spoke out against it. So I think you're right. There was definitely alignment between what was said before, during, and after.
Yes.
As much as I can tell. I think they were described as one of the initial sponsors, like financial sponsors of the institution, did come out and say, like, hey, this is not... we're not in agreement with this. This does not capture our views, etc. Right? But that was one of the first things I thought too. Is like, reading between the lines a little bit of what I read, but more so what he said, the text of his whole speech. I got the sense it's like, well, my wife does this, therefore I'm able to do this. But what I don't understand and it just doesn't make sense as he says it. So a woman those can be the two of some of the proudest titles that she holds. A man, likely the two proudest titles that he holds, but one can have a career and one can't.
Yeah, and that's why I come back to the multiple roles that a man is able to hold versus a woman's singular position and destiny. To me, that's just such an interesting point to consider. I think regarding educating women for the purpose of motherhood, I think we got to be a little bit careful there, because I think that, what I respect most fundamentally is a woman's right to choose what she wants to do. And if that's what fulfills her and makes her happy, then she should be a stay-at-home mom as her vocation. I am fully in support of whatever they choose. So,
Choice.
if you want to, go have an education and then choose to be a mother, that is a great thing. So
I think that's basically it. It's all about choice and being seen as a full human being to make the choices that we want to make in our lives and the path we want to take. Whereas he's saying your choice really is like the proper choice for women is to be a wife and a mother. And you've been tricked into thinking that you're going to find fulfillment in these other paths. And what you're saying, that men are allowed to be multidimensional and have multiple interests.
Yes.
And women are not they're supposed to be solely focused on the home.
Yeah.
And we know that's not true.
No.
Like people are people. And you hear that from the LGBTQ 2+A group also. People are people. Let people just be people. But that's where I think there's a lot of constriction in politics around trying to get people back in their boxes, the traditional boxes.
Yeah. So that's something that keeps coming up for me too. I remember right before this speech came out, I was talking to a colleague of mine who is very supportive of EDI initiatives. And he said to me, he's like, listen, I think I think we're getting it. I think we can take our foot off the gas, or I think we need to focus differently. And I was like, listen, we've been talking about it for a long time. We've been having the same conversations, covering the same topics, but I'm not seeing change. But let me think about that for a little bit. Because he's somebody I respect. And when somebody hey, I'll go take it back and I'll think about it for a while. When I heard this again, I was like, no, there are still men telling women how they should be living their life. We're not even close to there yet. And I get it.
And there's still women listening, even if that's not what they agree with.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and that's what I think it is. It's that conditioning, right?
Yes.
My mom and my grandma will tell you that they wouldn't have changed a thing about their lives. They're very proud mothers and mothers and partners. They were really, really happy. But they were also not conditioned, maybe that's not the right word. They also grew up in a reality, an external environment where the only thing reflected back to them was that is the path, that is the only path, that is the only path that brings you any respect, trust, and honor, right? So is there choice in that? When your environment is conditioning you from day one, I keep using that word, so maybe that is the right word, but when your environment keeps reinforcing for you that there's one path and one path only, is there really choice?
I think conditioning is a good word. In my own childhood, I had an interesting contrast between my grandmothers. My maternal grandmother was a traditional stay-at-home wife. They lived on a ranch. She had 5 children, let alone a very large crew to feed twice a day, and she very much took on that role. Although I remember from a young age realizing or thinking, maybe not realizing, thinking or having indications that she was not happy or fulfilled in that role. My paternal grandmother had a very different story, and I think it's quite pivotal for the way my thinking was shaped. So she was a nurse. She was trained as a nurse, and then she married my grandfather. And my dad was the oldest of 2 sons. And when he was born, she had very bad postpartum. And my grandpa, for whatever reason, how it came about, said, you know, you should go back to work part-time as a nurse. I will look after our son, and you go back to work 2 afternoons a week. And, you know, we lived in a small town where she would travel to the next small town and go work in this clinic as a nurse. And I grew up with that story. But as I grew up thinking about the differences between my 2 grandmothers, it was startling to me, but also very enlightening of my grandfather to do that. And I don't think he was trying to support feminism at the time. He was a farmer, so he did have the winter off, and you know, they probably could need the money from her work. So there's maybe a lot of practical consideration, but I think it was pivotal and progressive and created a very strong contrast for me to think about between my grandmothers at a young age.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because so regardless of, because they grew up around the same time, probably very similar environments, but...
And their partners were key in that role unconsciously, right? You know, I don't think consciously, you know, my grandpa was trying to support feminism. But I think that, and nor was my maternal grandmother saying, this is your role. It was just assumed, you know, that was the partnership. It was just assumed. I don't believe it was, you know, talked about or analyzed. So, yeah.
So why, the other thing that, because I want to get off of this, but why did the Harrison Butker thing, why did he receive a standing ovation? Because that was the other thing that was startling for me too, is like, in addition to his remarks, the fact that it was received by a crowd that was majority women, he received a standing ovation that day.
Well, this is going to get kind of dark, but I think, you know, there is a movement in the U.S. That is starting, or maybe it's very much underway, around white nationalism. And I think this is like he is putting out that perspective, and that, you know, this is a Christian nation. These are the roles that everyone should fit. And then also implied in that is a white nationalism that's there. And so the population has changed dramatically, right? There is like a lot of diversity in the population. And so I think there's groups that feel threatened by that, and they're shoring up, they want to shore up their power base. He's talking to that group about, this is how we need to be. And I think that's where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So he's attacking all these groups that are like, different and are challenging traditional notions of society. Watching the news and what's going on, particularly in the United States, I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, in reviewing and watching many media takes and stories on this issue, repeatedly the word that came to mind and was frequently used was, you know, just the polarization between the 2 political parties in the United States. And I think it is an important overarching theme that we need to consider specifically for Harrison Butker and where he was coming from and why he was supported. You know, there's many quotes that you can find very easily, you know, calling it a textbook case of conservative sexism and homophobia, right? You know, conservative Catholics tend to support the Republican Party ideals and their agenda. And, like you say, they're gathering and, lining up to add to this extreme polarization and lack of middle ground in
Yes.
American politics.
Yeah.
I think this concept and these values, opinions, not values, exist elsewhere and in Canada as well. It's just not near as polarized.
Actually, we might be benefiting from having a 3-party system here as opposed to a 2-party system in the U.S.
That's a good point, Leena.
More voices, and it may also speak to just the historical basis of both countries, whereas the U.S. was like the Wild West.
Yeah.
Very individual, like, you're going to make it on your own effort, and
Capitalistic.
yeah, whereas the Canada had a totally different start, and I
Yes.
think we see those threads coming out.
I think that is a good point. We have more socialistic feel for sure than the United States. And I do agree with the 2-party versus 3-party system adds a much different element. There's still disappointing things about it, of course, but just the social structure of our healthcare and our support systems is quite different.
Most people understand that Canada is a country of immigrants. We're used to being in communities that are diverse in nature. I think Saskatchewan maybe is seeing more of that over the last 2 or 3 years. There's less of that. Hopefully, what I hope is that there's less of like defend our way of life, because our way of life has always been in partnership with a variety of different cultures.
It is important to understand that a new Canadian, the social construct and the political construct of our country, we have a middle class. And, there is less middle class maybe than there was, and that is a topic of conversation. But we do have a true middle class with support systems to allow people to succeed. The United States polarization, again, comes to mind between the rich and the poor and the lack of middle class. Which does affect some of these extreme views.
So flipping topics a little bit here, what is the message we would have liked to have been presented to young men and women as they're about to graduate, regardless of what institution they might be graduating from?
I've said this to some of the junior people in my office, and really there is no rules about how you do something. Yes, within legal terms, but in terms of our jobs and whatnot, like, you can be creative, you can push the boundaries, you can come into a job with your full person. It's like, bring that creativity in. Yeah, so I guess that would be my message to convocating classes, like, approach life like, grab it and do what you want, do what you're interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a more neutral platform for our young people and our graduates, and they need to figure out how they want to shape their life and take steps to shape their life, both personally and professionally, and then in the way they see fit.
So we've talked about, that neutral platform. What do we want young women specifically? So 18, 20, 25-year-old us to know. So we're women that were, I'm making some assumptions here, but we probably at some point realized we wanted to have a career and realized that if we wanted to have children or a family, that we needed to balance that in some type of way.
The number one piece of advice is be very thoughtful about who you choose as your life partner.
100%. That is
Agree.
critical. That is the single most important decision you will make in your life.
By far.
Yeah.
For men too.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, if you have decided, like I decided to go into engineering, and if I decided my partner was someone who didn't think that women should be in science, that would be a huge problem. So it's absolutely the number one thing, and also to really talk before you make that commitment, and talk about, do you want a family, and how is that going to go, and who's going to stay home, and how is everything going to kind of shake out, and then work out those details, talk about it. It's super important, because you may not have actually thought it through, either of you, and then those assumptions around how I think my life is going to go will come out, and it's very, very important to understand each other and where you're going.
Yeah, it's having those conversations, but really understanding the values and the character and what your partner has.
I agree with that. When we talk about this neutral platform, I think it's a large sliding scale and different for every individual. And there's many things that factor that neutrality, let's call it, on, gender norms and expectations. It could be the school you're in, or if you're part of a religious group and your immediate family. So it's a sliding scale, but we all need to work through our bias. We all have bias. We all have different levels of bias on different issues related to our relationships and expectations and how we value ourselves as an employee, as a mother, as a wife. So, a lot of my programming, even though I had some exposure to that, I had a lot of deprogramming to do in my life. And I think that's true for everyone. And being conscious about that, just like you mentioned, being conscious about those expectations if you're thinking of getting in a relationship, we have to look inward and do that work on ourselves for ourselves.
We really need to, so it's in selecting the partner, but then it's also like the ongoing dialogue around expectations, asking, like, because we still, like, till this day in 2024, we live in a world that's better situated or really designed for women to take, when the baby's sick, be the person who takes the day off from work, do the vast majority of drop-offs and pickups. Even really, like, I feel like it's been in the last 5 or 8 years that I've started to see restrooms, family restrooms that are gender neutral, where either dad can go do the diaper change or mom can do the diaper change, right? So I think in addition to, like, selecting the right partner, I think in the way that you make those decisions, and I know even for me, like, and part of it is maybe my personality, part of me is the way that I was conditioned and I grew up. I can do it all the time and take care of it and make it easy for everybody else. And I think a lot of women are conditioned or grow up with those values, is you're people pleaser by nature, because you're rewarded when you're doing for others and you're receiving negative feedback, or almost chastised when you're thinking about yourself, right? That is true in my life. So I'll speak just for myself. But so for me, my default is, well, don't worry about it, I can cover that. And if she's got a doctor's appointment, I can cover that. Or don't worry about this, like, I can balance it a little bit better, right? And that's just not the case, right? And then it goes back to, like, I've talked about this before, but paternity leave. Like, if men start taking more paternity leave, and I know it's happening in some organizations. I was just talking to somebody from PCL and they're seeing it quite a bit. I think
that's amazing.
Wright as well.
Yes. Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Hatch yet?
I'm sorry, I don't know, but I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't have the data either. This is just all kind of perceptions, right? So I think if you can get men taking paternity leave as well, it just checks so many different boxes, right? Like you've now, there's nothing more humbling than sitting at home with a newborn and figuring out how to do all of it. You become a better parent because you're there for every single tough moment and you learn to do all the things versus have somebody else there with you. Like, you learn by doing, right? So now you're going to become a better father, a more hands-on father. You're going to become a better partner because you've allowed your partner to go back into the workforce to continue her career. But also she has a more set of capable hands at home now because you've done it all, and there is no hesitation, right? And then you're also, when we're promoting women or men, Leena, to your point, like you said before the cameras came on, we're not thinking about, oh, if she's a woman, she might take maternity leave. Because the reality is a man or a woman might take a maternity or paternity leave, and you just manage it as an organization. It's not unique to one gender or the other, right?
Mm-hmm. One of my pet peeves when I was doing my research was that this assumption at work that we don't live in society, that you're just sort of come out of a cabinet and go to work and then go back in the cabinet. It's not like that. We
like
all live
work versus life.
Right.
It's
like
the same.
It's the same.
Yeah.
So let's acknowledge that people have families and they have other things going on, and create a space that they can be the most productive at work by supporting what's going on outside of work. Yeah. And that's acknowledging that people have families and they may have to take kids for appointments. And then also there's like the sandwich generation problem where you have kids and elderly parents also needing help, and acknowledging that that's happening. But, you know, you want the best people to work for you. So create an environment where they can thrive.
Yeah. And recently, I think earlier this year, I was at a day of learning type event, and there was a gentleman who came because in my remarks at that event, I had talked a little bit about my journey back into the workforce after I had my daughter, and just kind of designing the way that I wanted it to work versus how like the organization was set up to make it work. And I talked about some of the flexibility I took, which I've talked about it in previous podcasts. For the first while, I was starting later in my day, and my husband and I were staggering it. And he said, listen, I want to ask you an honest question. So he's a leader. I think it's actually his own business, a leader of a business in Regina. And he said to me, he said, there's somebody on my team. She's just come back from maternity leave. She's asking for an accommodation, much like what you're asking. And like, I'm fine to do it. I think like it's not really going to change the organization. I'm going to get the results that I need, but I'm worried about setting a precedent, because the folks in the field that are doing the physical work, which is very crew based, you need X amount of people running the equipment to do the work on a job site. I can't give somebody in that setting the same type of accommodation that I would give this woman who works out of an office. And that's more my concern than anything. And I hadn't really even thought about it until he asked about it, other than to know that like in my workplace, it's the same. Different jobs and different roles, depending on what you're doing, you can have different levels of accommodation. And what I said to him, I said, up to the point the business can bear. Whatever the business can bear, and that changes from position to position. In our case, it changes for time of year as well. We could provide more flexibility in the winter than we can during the construction season in the summer. I just said, whatever, you really should push it up to the point that the business can bear. And yes, you're still going to have some uncomfortable respond to some uncomfortable questions and have some discussions around why you can accommodate somebody in the office like that, but not in the field. But people will understand, at least I hope that people will understand, that it's not all fair, and different positions and different organizations and different teams can accommodate different work arrangements, right? But it brings me to like, how do you accommodate the people running the equipment, the people in the field, in the plants, that really it's team-based and equipment-based? Like, how do you start to create flexibility there? That's maybe a bigger topic than what we're trying to address here, but I think it really is important up to the point that the business can bear.
One thing that came very clear to me in my work is that, like, I've been an office person for all of my career, and I understand the dynamics and the work cadence of that. And in the case of other kinds of roles, I would ask those people who work in those roles, how do you think you can adapt this to allow for flexibility? Because, you know, as managers, we come in and like, oh yeah, well, we can do it like this and this and this, but we don't know. You should actually workshop it with the people in those roles. And I think you'd probably be surprised how creative, like what interesting solutions they'll come up with.
Yeah. The one place we've been able to do it was almost like a work share type thing. And this was specific to a custody arrangement. We had a ready mix driver. We had 2 ready mix drivers that had could only work partial days, which in concrete, there is no partial days. You like come in, you set up your truck hauls 3 to 4 loads a day. Each load takes 2 to 3 hours. Like, it's a long day. And they had worked it out so that, you know, the 3 days that she had to go home early were the 3 days that he could stay late, and vice versa. So work share, and that was a solution that came from the workforce. But again, the business could bear it, not an issue. Made it work. Yeah, but it is. You're right. You gotta integrate the ideas coming out of the people doing the work, because we have no idea. We think we do, but we don't.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, you know, what the business can bear. Obviously, businesses have to be making money in order to stay in business. But, you know, businesses in our industry of construction are losing a lot of dollars every day due to lack of workforce or lack of skill within their workforce. So, you know, I think that we do need to open up our minds and think about, you know, if you had engaged people, and how would we rearrange or arrange differently the workforce and the crew to maintain safety standards and get the work done with the nature of the work that's being done, we have to go there. Because lack of workforce is something just being talked about. And it's not really, the solution is not coming. So we do have to think outside the box. And, construction is such a time spent type value system. And, that is, of course, more prevalent in pouring concrete or the amount of time that it takes to frame a building or whatever. We all work in people hours for the productivity it takes to do a task. But we still have to start shaking that up. It does make sense, and safety has to come first. But we have to get creative. We do have sites that, in the winter, we squish down hours. And the typical set hours that our sites would run would be 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. We did have 2 sites this past winter that started at 9 and went till 5. And due to childcare, and it was all due to childcare. And we actually didn't have, they were smaller sites. So, once again, it not applicable to all sites and not workable in all situations. But the conversation was had, and none of the crews were opposed to that. 5 p.m. was still a workable day. It was a great solution to those 2 small sites.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is like we have to think outside of the box. We can't be worried about fairness and painting every situation with the same brush necessarily. Each situation is unique. Each person's situation is unique, and you have to really be able to find a way to make that work for everybody, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our performance review metrics have to adapt. When I first started in the industry, it was very much a time spent equation, So, the gentleman who was there at 7 a.m. and stayed till 7 p.m., he was highly revered of the time spent in his work. Was he running his hockey pool and his golf pool 2 hours a day? He was, in that case. That's not saying that everybody was, but, what is the value you're bringing to the organization, and how do we get that balance the best we can?
So right now, so far, like other than your partner, what else do we want these young women to know? So I've talked in previous podcasts about this topic of psychological safety. You need to have a work environment that has trust in it while you're navigating some of these unique or difficult situations, specifically around maternity leaves, coming back to work, accommodations. I think there does need to be high levels of trust in the organization that you work for. And I'm like, listen, I'm only 20 years in, but in the 20 years, in the same company, but within that company, I've been lucky enough to work for leaders where there's high levels of trust, and I can sit down and have a conversation and trust that we're going to work on it together, and it's going to be very collaborative. And I've had situations where I don't have that. But I do think that as a young woman who's thinking about adding children to her life, if there's any pink flags at work, you might want to convert those to red, because there is no other more vulnerable time in your life than when you're navigating those challenging situations, right? So I think just in addition to the partnership at home, the leadership and the partnership and all of those really important relationships in a workforce are doubly as important to a woman navigating those situations than at any other point in her career or a man's career. And I hope like one day I would give that same advice to men, because they're going to need the same things that women are needing, but I don't think that's the case quite yet.
Yeah, that's ideal for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. The youth that I see coming into our organization and our industry are quite aware and are asking a lot of great questions. I do wonder if the top priority is getting our leaders to create better dialogue and understanding around some of these youth's questions. And, my kids are 17 and 20, and they teach me a lot about this stuff, but I'm learning from them all the time. So I think that, of course, youth need to decide what they want. have good conversations and ask very critical questions when considering their options. But we as leaders need to have good answers. That's where I see the biggest growth area, not with advising our youth. That's not how you put it, but I think they're already,
They are.
approaching it in a very sophisticated way. Yeah.
What are, just for example's sake, what are some of the questions you're getting that you find very interesting?
Well, I think that flexible work is obviously, even if there's not a family or children involved, or, caregiving of a parent, that is a topic of conversation. Youth are interested in, that I work with is, what are the things that you need me to accomplish today, this week, and in my roles and responsibilities. And if I can do those in 7 hours instead of 9 hours, what is the problem? So, pushing the, not having, they're not at the stage where they're thinking about family or that kind of stuff. Those are the questions they want to ask. They question the rules and the rigidity of the structure of the work employee-employer relationship at its very fundamental level.
Yeah.
In all types of ways. Yeah, and what do we really want from our employees?
Yeah. What were the key things we're trying to accomplish out of each role?
Yes.
And can that be done in a different way than what we've traditionally thought about? Coming to your office every morning at 8 a.m. and sitting there till 5 p.m.
Yes.
Regardless of what's done.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, just speaking with the 8 to 5, hours, very strict hours, the conversation easily goes to, being available on your cell phone, being available on your emails during your site's working hours.
Right.
If you need to, or want to start work at 9 and, work till 6, as long as you're available for your team during the team's core hours. I think some people are, some of our leadership is on board with that, and we still struggle with that concept.
Sure.
They're lazy. They don't come to work till 9, that's just not the case.
Or the perception that the job's not getting done if
Right.
your butt is not in your desk chair for X amount of hours every day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the gaps? And this one's important, is what are the gaps from a leadership perspective that need to be addressed more so than maybe the young men and women?
Well, you were talking about trust in the organization, and I think that's like a really big question. And I think it needs to be quantified. And it's a really uncomfortable conversation that organizations probably don't want to have, is actually ask your employees what they actually think about. Like, do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you can raise these things?
Yeah.
Obviously you can't. You feel comfortable. I think there's a lot of situations where women may hide their pregnancies and find a way to adjust and not want to bring their family life into the organization at all because they feel like it would be a detriment. It would be held against them.
Yeah. They'll lose the promotion before
Right.
they've even had an opportunity at it because they're pregnant, that they won't get the good projects and the good. Yeah.
Like I've sat in salary calibrations, the annual process, and somebody asking, was she a mother? Totally irrelevant to the conversation.
Yeah.
But that was the question. And nobody asked about anybody else if they were a father.
Yes.
And almost everybody were parents.
Yeah.
So it's like right there, is there trust in that organization? So I think, if you're really genuine about wanting to create that completely open, diverse workforce, you have to ask yourself these questions.
And so recently I went through a course, and we didn't get into it, but it was very briefly discussed that sometimes the way that we talk about trust in organizations is actually employee engagement. So we measure employee engagement because it's a little bit, you can send out a survey and kind of put a number on it and understand how you're doing relative to different teams or your peer group. But what it actually is trust. And there's two different types of trust. So there's head trust, and head trust is, do I trust this leader to make the right decisions for the team, the organization, results driven? And then there's heart trust. And his heart trust is, do I trust this person to make the best decisions for me? And I think that's where we fall apart, right? Where there's been historically such a large focus on short-term financial results, which leads to good head decisions, right? But not necessarily good people decisions, I think. And I think that's a fundamental shift in how organizations are going to have to operate. We're managing and we're leading these young people that are asking these questions, that our systems are it's highlighting that our systems are archaic and our systems are broken, and we're paying for time for roles that really we're paying for the role.
You know, a little bit different approach. You know, there's two small things in the organization that I work with that, you know, I was thinking about through preparing to talk with you, that my boss has done. And they're very simple. They're almost kind of laughable simple. But the more I thought about it, had long-lasting ripple effects on our culture, and I think the emotional health of our employees and the psychological safety. He is in his mid-60s, and about 5-6 years ago, he became a grandpa. And I think that, and this is me being presumptuous, and but I think when his children were little, he worked a lot. But when these grandchildren came along, there was a noticeable long-term shift in him. And these grandkids are the focus of his world. And, you know, he picks them up from daycare and is very stressed about missing the deadline at picking them up from daycare. He leaves early to go to their soccer games and to their hockey games. And he has pictures in his office and he talks about them. And, you know, he's a guy who's genuinely excited about his grandchildren. I don't think he embarked on being passionate about his grandchildren's lives to change the culture at our work, but it has dramatically changed the culture at our work. And, you know, I've worked there for a long time, and he's always supported our family in raising our children. I got very lucky in the situation that I was in. But, you know, a lot of other employees didn't know that. They didn't see that. They weren't having intentional conversations with him about those types of topics. So that was the first example that came to mind that, you know, has a phenomenal impact on our culture. The second is that he's a very chatty social person, and he has a unique way of connecting with people. And, you know, you talk about office water cooler conversations, and a lot of situations, water cooler conversations are quite exclusionary. You know, they're focused on sports. That's primarily what I see. They're focused on sports, talking about whatever sport it is and who gold. And the people that aren't interested in that sport do not make those connections with leadership, you know, whether it's at lunch or at the water cooler. Something so very simple. Yep. But he goes out of his way to find what that person is interested in, and then talks to that person about what they're interested in.
Yeah. Can we name him? Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I've been lucky enough to come across Wright.
Yes.
In the industry. And listen, just on nature of being a young woman coming up through the space, I wasn't intentionally excluded. And we've had this conversation, because my peer group wasn't around. And I remember meeting Lauren, and I remember that about him. I remember that this man came and expressed interest in me. And then the next time that I ran into him, followed up with like, oh, hey, your boyfriend's working in Namibia. How's that going? Tell me about that. And I think Wright, in his very simple and subtle way, was so powerful. I'm glad that you shared that about Lauren.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated.
That's fantastic. And like I've observed this also in my career, is that the organization takes the personality of the person at the top.
Yes.
And their attitude and the way they engage with everybody absolutely permeates the rest of the organization. So that can be a super positive thing. It could also be a highly negative thing.
Yeah,
and I think
very true.
I've experienced both, and it's absolutely true.
Yes.
You know, you had brought up trust, and that organizations really need to reflect on whether they actually do have trust in their organization. Right. And I think really to move the needle on anything is that you need data. And I think organizations need to be held accountable for that data. So I think a lot of organizations know what their diversity is and what their gender split is, but they don't talk about it. And they really need to talk about it. And they need to be open about, this is our gender split at the different organizational levels, and this is the average salary at each. And that will open up, like, and I know they don't want to do that because it opens up a can of worms.
Yeah.
It will be ugly.
Yeah.
But really to, address these issues and understand their organization and what's going on, I think they need to do that. Because I think inevitably, when you're in a position of managing people, you have high performers and low performers. And like, how do you manage that through a lens of gender? And like, what biases am I bringing to the table here?
Right.
And so I think you need to have, you have your individual data points, but you have to look at the population and see, in our junior ranks, we have a 50-50 split. In our senior ranks, we have one person. It's not even a percentage point, right? And so you need to really kind of acknowledge, okay, there's something funny going on here. People are not, maybe we're early in our travels in this space, but maybe we're not. And why are the women not getting up in the organization? There's something going on. We need to take a look at it. But the only way you're going to do that is by looking at the data and then also holding yourself accountable to your company and showing them this is what it is. And, we're trying to address it and we're interested in what your feedback is. Yeah. It's very, very tough. Like, I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but I don't know how you would solve it because everyone comes to the table with their own inherent biases.
Yes.
And how do you fix that when you're dealing individually, one-on-one all the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, the word that just keeps coming in my mind as I'm listening to you, Leena, is vulnerability. Having those statistics, exposing where we're currently at, and being vulnerable to open up and share that and learn by it from the whole organization. I think that's definitely part of the key, but it's tough.
It is tough, and I will say, I feel like for the last, let's say, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, we're definitely talking a lot more about it as an industry and as an organization. And a lot of the easier actionable things is to bring in the speaker, to bring in some training, to maybe understand our biases and things like that. And I was really hopeful when these things started to happen. However, now I'm just frustrated because I think that these things have been happening and we've been talking about it, but nothing is changing.
It's a way to check the box to say we're doing something in some cases, but is it having the desired effect? What is the desired effect?
Exactly.
We know the end goal of the numbers, but there's a lot of desired effects in the middle.
Yeah.
We talk about, fatigue in the EDI space. And, as I'm approaching 30 years of working, it's like I've heard everything. I've had all the training, and yet things are better. I would say they are better, but are they appreciably different? I don't know. So it's these are really good questions about, are we just checking a box?
Yeah. It feels like we're talking for the sake of talking.
Yeah.
And the reason it's so hard is I feel like maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago, there was really black and white things that needed to change. But the gray is tough. It's like the bias is in how we receive women. The bias is in how we make decisions. The bias in how we pay and promote and perceive performance. It's how, there's a motherhood penalty. I don't care what anybody says. There is a motherhood penalty.
Absolutely.
And there's lots of research and data on the tangible dollar impact of it. There isn't on the promotions you didn't get, on the opportunities you didn't get.
I think one of the things that I see, and I've seen in my own relationship and my own journey, and it might not be a popular way to approach it, but I think we really have to zoom in to the men. And, talking about EDI and then saying, let's zoom in on the white man just doesn't make sense on its face. But, back to our conversation on supporting paternity leave. I mean, if you have a supportive paternity policy that your employees are engaged in, the ripple effect of that is massive.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, that's one of the things that I think would help create a fresh look and a fresh start. I think there are men in the workforce who want to spend more time with their children and feel guilty or pressured to, have more traditional values. So that's not to take away from what we're trying to do for women and other underrepresented groups, but it's our greatest impact. If we can make a 2% impact on the white man, we now have some serious momentum. I think that to me is a key part of where we should go, even though it's a criticized, I think it would be a criticized opinion.
To focus on white men and the opportunities for them to become more involved partners.
Take men being an active 50-50 parent. Let's just take that one concept, okay? So, now we're going to support men to have more time with their children, be less ostracized at work for being involved with their children and caring for their children. It kind of by default feels like, oh, wow, now we're supporting the group that already needs the least support, right?
Yeah.
But it's not, if we really support them, which I also think is a very tangible, quick movement. We talk about lack of progress in some of these initiatives.
Right.
I think that one's a quick magnetic one that would catch on. And in our organization, it has caught on.
With Lauren becoming a very involved grandfather.
That's right. And, having some of our senior site staff, which our site is a more masculine environment than the office, have the courage to say, I want to spend time with my new baby. I want to help my wife and support her in this journey. And by default, that has a ripple effect on his wife and better for his children.
Yeah,
and all his peers going, wow, if that macho masculine guy who's having children later in life can take that approach, why can't I?
That's another aspect of feminism, in that childcare is very much gendered. It's female based, and to imply that men are interested, it sort of decreases their masculinity. You know what I mean? And that's like a no-no. Right. So men who express interests in the female area, like typical female interests, are always kind of, denigrated.
Right.
So wanting to be engaged with their family, well, that's not very manly, right? And then, what feminism is trying to do is like everyone is interested in all aspects of anything, and they shouldn't be penalized. Like, why are certain things gendered?
And that's just it. We always talk about the masculine, feminine as like two independent things.
Right.
The reality is each of us operates in our feminine and our masculine.
Yeah.
And it's just that some of those traits, some masculine traits are celebrated in both in women, and some feminine traits are only celebrated in women, but not men, and vice versa, right? So it's how do we, and it goes back to like that trust thing as well, right? So if we can celebrate that desire to nurture and raise and really participate in a child or grandchild's upbringing in men, if we can celebrate that in men, would we then get to a place where we can celebrate that in a different way with women? If we can celebrate a feminine, I'm going to give it a feminine name, a feminine trait of nurturing and really having empathy and caring for people, can we then find a way to celebrate that same trait in our male leaders? Right? Like it's kind of taking it's not weaponizing these traits and how they show up in certain genders anymore. It's really kind of making it even in the sense that both men and women can embody both traits, but then we have to find a way to eliminate our biases and celebrate that.
Yes.
And we're not there. That's the thing, right? Like we can celebrate nurturing children and women, but we can't quite get there with men. We can celebrate that masculine ability to be decisive and to lead in men, but we really quite can't get there with women unless they soften it up a little bit for us, right? It's how do we find a way to eliminate our biases so that we can see the balance in both in everyone.
I had a lot of bias that I had to work through. You know, I had a husband who was willing to participate, and we intentionally negotiated participating in raising our family and our careers. But I had trouble letting go of the control. You know, I did. I can't say I didn't, you know. I'd criticize him for how crooked he put the diaper on all the time. Like, you know, so much poop everywhere because he was putting it on wrong. And, you know, and I criticized him for that. And I didn't give him room, especially in those early days, to, you know, figure it out along the way. So, you know, I was part of the problem in figuring that out. I mean, I also felt less of a mother, you know, when I went back to work and was spending less time with my children. I got over that, but it was an internal struggle that I really had to go through.
Yeah.
So I would say that, you know, not internally within our company, but within our industry, he got ostracized more than I did for sharing parenting roles, for leaving early to go pick up the kids, and for coming late and dropping them off. And we would, you know, share when they were sick. And he got ostracized for that more than I did. Yeah. So it was an interesting flip of the coin and, you know, men don't talk about that.
No.
Right? So we need to get them talking about that.
Yes.
Well, it kind of comes back to Harrison Butker saying women belong in the home and men belong at work. And these two lines shall not cross.
Right.
So men are penalized for crossing that way, and women are penalized for coming to work. It's the same. It's the same issue.
Yeah.
That we're trying to solve here.
Yeah.
If we solve it for women, we'll solve it for men.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what you're saying though is we all have these biases, right? So I think
Absolutely.
and that for the longest time, I think when we started talking about inclusivity, it felt like for many men an attack on them, right? Until they got to understand it a little bit better. And we're all the problem.
Yep.
You know, COVID was terrible, but I think one of the really good outcomes is that it opened up everyone's minds to flexible work arrangements. And what I see at my workplace is that everyone has got quite used to working at home. And so if something is going on, there's just a note sent out to the group saying, hey, I'm working from home. I have a couple of appointments. And everyone's just like rolls with it. It's fine.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm working in an office environment that probably wouldn't work on a construction site very well. But, you know, like that was really, really good. And I think that kind of opened up the conversation around flexibility a bit more. And that the whole, what did you call it?
Time spent versus value given,
as opposed to value,
Yeah.
which really raised that question. And during COVID is that we're all working from home. The work is still somehow getting done.
That's
Weird,
right. That's right. It is one of the.
You didn't know I worked on that between 3 and 5 a.m. last night, but
That's right.
You know, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
So to organizations, we're saying explore parental leave, encourage parental leave, and just really encourage that balance of raising children between your male and women leaders. We're saying leadership at the top. Are you conducting yourself in a way that your leadership can be received and felt throughout the entire organization? Or are you talking about hockey around the water cooler?
No matter how good your policies are, no matter how good your hiring is, no matter how good your training is, no matter how good your support is, if you do not have that role model at the top, it's done.
It's irrelevant.
It's
People
irrelevant.
won't want to stay. They
No.
won't be engaged in the work that they're doing. They won't be
People
engaged.
have very good bullshit detectors, right?
Exactly.
They say something and then you see the action. If they don't mesh, you know.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always freaking the amount of times, well, how are we going to present this information to this person so that they think it's A instead of B? It doesn't matter how we present it. people understand the truth, right? People understand, like, it might take them a minute because we've dazzled them with the BS or the facade or the policy that's not really, we're not wanting to implement, but eventually people get to the truth. You cannot lie to an entire organization of people. People are smart. People have gut checks that they're just like, that did not resonate. That did not feel right.
Well, you expect people to come, like you want the smartest, most capable people, but you only want them to be super smart in this way and be incredibly stupid.
Yeah, compliant. Be compliant.
Yeah, like don't, it doesn't work that way.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what we're saying is really addressing the bias in the systems and the decisions, but the people as well. Right. And that's a lifelong journey.
It is.
The minute you think you're aware of all your biases and start to address them, the next batch will show their head. That's just, it's ingrained in who we are and what we are, what the society and everything that has been our environment.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think circling back to the Butker speech, there's several layers of bias there when you look at why the crowd clapped and, why people supported that. And we have to recognize that, so if you're, a young female in a similar environment with those beliefs around you, recognizing it and working your way through those, that's a big hill to climb.
The other one, unless you talk about this, but it hasn't come up yet today, ensuring that you're providing equal opportunity for development and advancement. And we've kind of talked about it in the way of thinking about like promotions and raises and that type of stuff. But, we talked about like, hey, if you wouldn't invite a young woman who's coming up through your organization out for lunch, don't do it with the young men. If you wouldn't invite her to the hockey game, don't invite the young men. Like, create an atmosphere where everybody gets an opportunity gets an opportunity for those networking events, that development, that intel.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do it under the thing of the title of networking or mentorship, and there's a lot of information on, maybe the challenges around older men mentoring younger females and, the perceptions of that. But, once again, I think we're after, how do we neutralize it? If it's okay to do with a young man and if it's not okay to do with a young woman, then we need to question that. Yeah. Is that a bias within us that it's not okay for one and it is okay for the other? Or is the activity truly not appropriate for anybody in a mentorship situation? Not just guys going for drinks every night or what have you. So we really have to question those activities and question our beliefs as mentors behind those activities. And once again, my boss, Lauren was very supportive. We traveled together to projects. I don't even think it was a thought in his mind that he's traveling around with this young girl and we're going to job. Like, I don't even think he realized that. Yeah. It was all professional. The trust was there. Never even crossed either of our minds. Yeah. But that's unique. So Agreed. How do we, grow towards that type of relationship?
Okay. So to the young men and women, we want them to be very mindful in the partner that they choose, because that will be the single biggest decision that they make.
Yes.
Yes.
To organizations, we want them to know,
if you want to change it, you need to measure it.
I like that. Yeah.
And a real close look at the leadership you have. If you're not getting the result you want, open up, be vulnerable, and what is really happening.
I want to ask one question. It's kind of taking us back a little bit earlier, but I keep thinking about it. So the role or hindrance of quotas around balanced leadership. Thoughts? So you hear this target.
Are there quotas?
I know, so I in this training session that I'm in right now, it's like multiple modules over multiple weeks, but I just happen to be in it with people in Europe and South America and all this type of, a lot of geographies covered in the session. And it sounds like in Europe, there is quite a few quotas around boards and leadership of publicly traded companies. the gentleman from the US, or sorry, the woman from the US, who she's a senior HR professional there, she indicated that they're actually getting away from it in the US. They're getting away from things like EDI and quotas and things like that. And South America kind of feels like they're in the same boat as Canada. Yeah.
I kind of get a bit, a little steamed at this. I actually am in favor of quotas. And the reason is that if we think that there wasn't any kind of bias, towards a group before, that's absolutely wrong. The bias was for men, 100%.
Yes.
And just keeping women out of the room completely. Yeah. And now we're trying to correct it. So, and a lot of organizations, they won't change unless they're forced to. And let's use safety as a parallel. Like, I think, industry people were dying regularly up until not that long ago, really.
Yes.
And, there were some fatalities in mining, and federal legislation came through, provincial legislation, and now suddenly, everyone's on board with safety, and you'd think, given where we are now, you would think, these companies came up with this and they're doing it on their own cognizance. But no, they were legislated. They have to ensure that they're not going to kill anybody anymore. And I feel like we're sort of in that same space, that this is a societal change. We have to actually hold people accountable and say, you need to fill these, you need to grow your people and get them into those spots.
I think there are some situations where quotas are extremely beneficial. In the space that we compete in, we are seeing more and more quotas to win jobs, and there's several things I like about that. It could be women or Indigenous-owned businesses. It could be women or Indigenous percentage population in the workforce that is working on the job. And there's many different versions of that. In competition against your peers to win this project, it creates a very good environment where you can't cheat the system. So I think that's very powerful, and I hope we see more of that. We don't, it can go too far and cause bad behaviors in different ways on the back end. Yeah. But I think there's absolutely some situations where it's very helpful. Yeah. People have to be innovative and figure it out.
And the criticism will come that you're not getting the best candidate if you have quota.
Yeah.
But did we have the best candidates before?
Yeah.
We have all encountered duds in the workplace, and you're like, how in the world did you get into your position?
In order to be a woman, to be promoted, you had to be exceptional.
Yeah.
But it didn't apply both ways, right?
No.
Yeah. So I have mixed feelings about quotas. And primarily at the time that my career and a couple others took off, there was quotas. They were very loose. They were something like 30% of senior leadership by X amount a year. Like, what does that even really mean? It came out of our corporate group out of Europe, and I don't know if it was really understood or really even communicated in North America, because I don't think it was a priority here. But anyways, it was kind of known about, kind of not really well understood. But I felt like a lot of women that were promoted during that time, and I don't think a single one of them were promoted because of the quota, because A, they were really good at what they did, and B, like they were in the organization before, like they were on the path before they got some big promotions into director and GM type roles. But the perception or some of the talk in the industry or in the company was, well, they got promoted because of the quota, right? So it doesn't matter how capable you are at that point, or how. And like the reality is you probably had to work harder, differently, and you had to stand out more so as a woman coming up, full stop. Like, I believe that to be true. I've seen it time and time again. But because the perception of the quota was like, oh, well, they're checking boxes again, right?
Yeah.
So that's the downside of it. But on the part of me that really supports it is, you're right. Like, until we're forced to change, we are not going to change. And I think I listened to a speaker and he said, you don't need to get to 50%. I think the number is 20 or 30%.
30%.
30%. Once you get to,
J.
yeah. Once you get to 30%, the views, the biases, the decision making starts to change of an organization, and it gains its own momentum. So like, listen, if we have to force organizations to consider women, to find the best women to make up that 30% so we can start radically transforming organizations, sign me up. 5 years ago I had a different view, but now I'm like, no, we need to let's quit talking, let's make some changes here, right? So we've talked a little bit about what young men and women need to know kind of coming up as they make decisions about how they're going to balance work, life, etc. We've talked about some things that organizations, maybe not some necessarily tangible actions, but certainly some ideas to take to the leadership table and discuss and figure out how you want to implement or not implement some of the ideas that we've given. One thing that we haven't talked about is how do we, so peer-to-peer, for example, support each other.
I do think that one of the things that is holding women back as a group is some of the common rules of engagement on women with their peers in the workplace. So I think that, as we're sitting with our peers and the women that, we work with and in our industries, it should be a focus of conversation. We tend to be more competitive sometimes with each other. We tend to, try to maybe undermine each other in some instances. And let's be honest, that's not helping anyone. It's not a professional behavior. It's not a supportive behavior. It's not anything that leads you to a position of leadership. So
I think it's sort of I call it the queen bee phenomenon. There can only be one. Maybe it's like Highlander too. There can only be one. There can only be one, which is absolutely not true. But I think, with our rarity in our industry, and it's like, oh, I've encountered another one. Now I must undo her because I can only be the only, it's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. Things only get better with more of us in place. But I think it's this queen bee mentality. And I want to be the chosen one amongst the guys.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of an internalized misogyny thing that I'm one of the guys. I'm going to behave like them. No, there can be nobody else. That's just me. I'm the friend. I'm the trusted advocate.
I have a slightly different perspective on it. Not that all that different, but slightly different. I think that because for so long coming up, most women who have made it to the top levels of companies and organizations have had to shrink or shift or modify or just really they were never ever able to show up as their most authentic self and be successful until maybe more recently. I'm starting to see this happen. I think that there's inherently resentment of anybody else at the table that's doing it differently than you because you weren't ever able to do it that way. And I'm talking specifically when there's a 10, 20, 15-year gap in the timelines coming up, maybe more than 10, 15,
So you mean
20.
they weren't able to show their true self, or they had to be masked or put in a box to survive in that environment?
Yeah.
So then what about that points that energy at another woman?
I don't know why, because I can't relate to it.
Right.
But I've experienced it multiple times, right? I've experienced it as just this need to control or shift, resentment. It's really just a feeling of resentment.
And it's resentment. Yeah, for some reason.
Yeah, it's like you use the word competitive. It feels like that, but I think it's actually more resentment and something more along those lines than competition itself per se, but self.
Well, I think we struggle with back to the Harrison Butker, we struggle with our identity, our purpose, the traditional value of what we were there for, how we gained attention and value in these systems. And that's still a struggle.
It's a huge struggle.
So it does play into that, let's say once you've made it and are in a leadership position, it's still a question.
Yeah.
What does that look like? We haven't had a lot of role models that have painted that picture for us.
It's such a complex topic, and it is so sensitive, and it is so tough. And I'm just so grateful that you guys came and shared your opinions with me and hopefully whoever needs to hear this podcast gets it, right? Like whoever's having these same experiences for me, because that's the other thing I forget. I feel like for the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've been having more of these conversations. But before that, I just lived in this like bubble. I lived in this like weird situation and like always kind of had these things, but I haven't really been able to verbalize them up until about that timeline. And now I remember the first couple years, every time I had one of these conversations, I walked out of there jazzed. I walked out of there feeling validated, feeling seen, feeling like, oh, there's a whole peer group that's lived this way for all these years. And it's not just me. And now, like, I've been fortunate enough to have had them for so many years that I think sometimes I forget what that first time felt like. And I hope that this podcast is someone's first time of feeling seen and heard and validated, and hopefully giving them a bit of a roadmap based on our experience. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Our Work with Pavan Sidhu, building better businesses and people, one episode at a time. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Pavan, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.